Welcome to the Freedom to Learn podcast. I'm your host, Ginny Gentles. This season, we're diving into what it means to return education to states, communities, and families. And we're exploring what becomes possible when education is freed from union dominance and federal control. Last November marked the 50th anniversary of IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Over 8.3 million children, or 15% of elementary and secondary school students, are designated as students with disabilities. Despite the existence of the federal law, as many parents of students with disabilities will tell you, the fight to ensure that their children's unique needs are met, whether it's through services and accommodations or a placement in a specialized private school, is often acrimonious, heartwrenching, and expensive. Debra Tisler, founder of Emergent Literacy and an educator with 30 years of experience, joins the podcast today to talk about the obstacles that parents face, the hostile and litigious due process regime, and why the law has not been reauthorized for over 20 years. But it's not all bad news. We also discuss improvements that could better serve students and families, including expanding education freedom programs that enable families to find and afford the best education options for their child's needs without exhausting and costly lawsuits. Debra Tisler, welcome to Freedom to Learn.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to delve into the details of IDEA, but let's start with your story first. You taught in Fairfax County Public Schools for a long time, I think from 1997 to 2014. What did you teach?
So I taught a mix of things because I'm certified as a teacher in special education and general education. So I taught at all levels from elementary school up through high school. One of the content areas that is my specialty is history. So I was able to teach what was called self-contained classes or small group classes for children with disabilities in the area of history across that spectrum. But then I also co-taught classes with a general education teacher as well. So that was in the mainstream setting. And then I also taught, pull-out resource for multi-tiered support services, and I also worked with the exceptional gifted population as well.
What was the nature of your training? Was that something that happened while you were in college or subsequently?
Yeah, so my undergraduate degree was in history again, but my certification there was in general education. So, with that endorsement in the area of history and social sciences. And once I got into the classroom in undergrad, I realized so many children were struggling,
Mm.
especially in the area of literacy. And in order to get that additional training, I decided to pursue my master's degree in special education where I could get that more specialized training.
Did you see things change over time? Did the education system change over time?
It did, and it grew more in the area of bureaucracy, more administrative focus rather than outcomes. And I believe that has been something that has, haunted the system to this point where the child's needs have been lost out of focus and it's become more adult oriented.
Well, November 29th of last year marked the 15th anniversary of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, although the law had a different name when it was first passed 50 years ago. What is your concise way to describe what IDEA originally promised?
So IDEA really allows all children to be able to access the public education system. Prior to IDEA and education for all handicapped children, that was really left up to a discretionary basis at the local school level at some point. So it's fundamentally a civil rights act that if you have a disability, you have access to your public education system. So it leads a foundation of that in its most basic form. It's an entry point in for children with disabilities. However, IDEA, we have a lot of compliance in there, and that focus on compliance over outcomes has really shifted a lot over time as we have grown more in that bureaucratic sense in education.
Yeah, I think any parent who's sat through a meeting about their child and their child's IEP, a term we'll get to, will be very familiar with that compliance orientation. I remember just always this giant stack of paper being dumped in front of me. I'm supposed to understand everything that's
Yes.
that's in there. Or maybe I'm not. I'm just supposed to sign it and say that I received it and that they had complied with this paperwork requirement. All right, so let's tackle some of these acronyms. The first one was IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Another big one would be FAPE. And people throw around the acronyms around IDEA a lot. I think sometimes to kind of like shut parents out, like, hey, we're on the inside, we're the experts, you're on the outside, like you need to trust us. We know the lingo. So let's break down the lingo a little bit. FAPE, free appropriate public education. What is that? What's FAPE?
The first part is free. Public education is that the parent is not to provide the funding for that. They've already paid their tax dollars. So that's part of FAPE. And then the other is appropriate, that what is being designed with the parent as an equal IEP team member is going to provide that meaningful progress, that that child is going to receive the instruction they need that meets their unique needs. That is what the funding dollars are supposed to be allocated for. And that's where it hits that divide there with implementation as to what's actually on the paper and what is getting implemented in the classroom in that school building.
A couple more acronyms.
Yes.
IEP.
It needs a whole dictionary for parents.
It does. And again, there's this whole like dividing line between expert and parents that gets thrown up, I think, because of these acronyms. But parents know what an IEP is. If they've been through the process, they just don't necessarily know how to ensure that they get the best one that meets their child's needs. IEP, what does that stand for?
So it's individualized education program, and it's a plan that is supposed to be part of the child's program that's individualized for their unique needs. So information is gathered from the school division through an evaluation process, through assessments, through data, and through what the parent brings to the table as well. That's why parents are not just guests at the table, they are equal IEP team members. And so all that information needs to be considered by the team, school-based team members, parents, or private providers that have been hired to support the child. And everyone is supposed to work collaboratively to build a consensus to develop that program for the child that's individualized.
And that's not a one and done kind of deal with IEPs, right?
Not all the time, no, it's not.
Right. So a child might need to be reassessed with a psychoeducational evaluation every few years. The IEP needs to be revisited. And it's not necessarily a forever thing. Kind of ideally, it wouldn't be a forever thing if you're talking about a child who is struggling with something but then overcomes it or acquires the skills to manage their disability in the classroom. Perhaps they don't need an IEP in the later grades, for example.
Exactly that. And I want to touch on that because, you know, for IDEA and the IEP process and the system in general, is that if early intervention and what's called child find works, so you find the child and you provide them the services early and you're helping that child with the appropriate services, there should be a shift in that level of service. It should be going down throughout the development of the child's IEP to a
Mhm,
point where possibly they exit from needing an IEP for some children.
mhm.
But over time, with that shift that we talked about earlier in education, these IEPs are growing more expansively over time in the opposite direction rather than showing that meaningful progress and growing and not needing those specially designed services and instruction.
Let's tackle one more acronym, LRE.
Yeah, that's a hot one. Least restrictive environment. Technically, it is the environment where the child is with their non disabled peers. It's considered more restrictive if they're with their disabled peers, and that restrictive level goes over how much time they spend during their day with disabled peers versus non disabled peers. And that can get a little tricky with parents too to understanding because of course they want their children to feel included, right? They want inclusion, but it all comes down to where is that child going to make the meaningful progress that they need to succeed. And in order to do that, that goes back to the school system to also collect that data that is quality data so that everyone can figure out, okay, does this child now have the skills to be in the mainstream setting with their general education non-disabled peers? When you talk about least restrictive environment for children, there's a whole continuum on that for those settings and placements.
When we had this 50th anniversary of IDEA, it was great. We should be celebrating that students with disabilities do have this right to access free, appropriate public education. That's a good thing. But I think that sometimes we pretend that everything has been great for 50 years. The law was passed, and then the system was fixed. And I don't think that anyone in the system would agree with that. But there's this like kind of make-believe sort of play acting that happens in Washington that scares off people from addressing the law and being honest about the problem. So let's talk about when an individual family has a problem. So they're going through the IEP process and they're realizing, that these folks are not listening to me. The parents, are saying like, I know what these evaluations are saying. I'm seeing what the reports are as far as how my child's operating in a classroom. Why is my child being denied services or accommodations to meet their needs? Like, what recourse do they have at that point? What happens then?
Well, they always have the right to request a new IEP meeting. They always have the right to request reevaluation, which opens up the opportunity for new evaluations and new data collection and new considerations for eligibility under IDEA and areas of eligibility. If they're unable to get anywhere with that process, they can file a state complaint. They could file an OCR, Office of Civil Rights complaint. They could file a due process complaint
Mm.
on their own as a parent. But many parents struggle with that. These are very costly administrative procedures that are, yes, part of the parent's rights. But if you don't know all the legalese, if you don't know all of these acronyms, you haven't built your own handy dandy dictionary for all of this,
Mm.
um, it's against you. The weight is definitely in favor of the school divisions. And so if you don't have, I've recently learned, some of the special education attorneys in the area where I live in Virginia, you're talking about a $15,000 upfront minimum deposit for a retainer to go to due process. It's extremely costly. You have to pay witnesses, right? Expert witnesses to come in because there is a heavy deference given to the school division. So you need expert witnesses. Like I said, it's extremely costly. So then it becomes to parents, if they even have funds, do I invest in due process, right? What am I going to receive out of this due process, if anything, where the system is stacked against me? Or do I invest that money now in a private school that will specialize in my child? Or do I invest that money now in private tutoring and services? And if you don't have the money for an advocate or an attorney to help you to navigate this system, it's even more stacked against you to get the outcome that you need, which is essentially restoring the rights of your child and, of course, yourself.
I never successfully navigated the IEP process on behalf of my daughter, who desperately needed occupational therapy and some other things in order to function in a classroom. So I feel like I failed her in this process as far as like making sure that her public education experience was a positive one. I failed her in the process, but I didn't fail her in the big sense. I pulled her out of the public school and then put her in a private school that met her needs. So that is that option that you mentioned that I'm familiar with, and then you mentioned the road of tutoring and external supports. I did that as well with private payment for occupational therapy and other therapies that she desperately needed to, in order to get ready to function in a classroom. Okay, so I did those two things, but I didn't do this due process thing. And my sense is, yes, it's expensive, but it's also lengthy, right? You're investing a lot of time in something that may or may not work out on behalf of your family, right?
Yes, it's a lot of time. It's physical and mental exhaustion all at once. You have to really build yourself up for that process as a parent, as well as the financial component of that, figuring out, is this where I'm going to my child's going to best benefit from those funds, or how else can I support my child with those funds? In Virginia alone, the stats were, less than 1% of these cases were in parents' favor. Rulings were in parents' favor. They're heavily in the district's favor.
This is after they've spent all of this money, hired a lawyer, called in witnesses, put together undoubtedly stacks of paperwork and documentation, and it's less than 1%?
Yes, yes. So it's extremely difficult to prepare for due process as well. That's also why it's costly, because often the attorneys that are representing the parents have to put in multiple subpoena requests and return responses on motions that the district has filed on simple things as access to the child's records. So you can't prepare for your own case or even to defend your child on your own if access to the education records is difficult, right? It can be obstructed throughout the process of this system. So you can't defend your position when the burden of proof is on you without that full access. So a lot of money is spent going back and forth on things that are basically, they're fundamental to try to, defend your position for your child.
What's a best case scenario if you go all the way through the process and you're one of the 1% that quote unquote win? What happens at that point?
Well, a lot of the due process cases, if you're going to invest in that type of funding for this, is private placement, right? Placement in a school that has the services that'll meet your child's unique needs.
Yeah.
And that tends to be, the larger reason why that parents would invest that type of money for their child.
Right, and so when you're talking about schools in our area in Northern Virginia, I know of one that's supposed to be excellent for children with dyslexia, another one for children who are on the autism spectrum. So these are private schools that are ready to serve the child and have that ability to do so, and then the public school district is paying for the child's tuition to go there. That's
Yes.
private placement.
Correct, yeah. So it's publicly funded private placement, right, at that school, and so there's a lot of evidence that has to go into, preparing for a case like that. I recently supported, a family that was seeking that, and they had an attorney, and I just was trying to help them organize that information, and it was a struggle. They eventually, the cost was too much for them to keep pursuing it. So they just reinvested that money back to their child when they saw how much it was going to cost in the long term with the attorney.
Deborah, this is why state school choice programs that are designed to provide funding for families to send their children to a private school just makes so much sense. You don't have to spend months, years, all this heartache fighting for your child to go to a private school. You receive an education savings account or you receive a scholarship, and you just send the child to that school. I understand that some of these specialty schools are very expensive, but that's where it's good when you have a state that adjusts the amount of the education savings account based on the child's level of disability. So, for example, Texas has a new ESA program. Students will receive about $10,000 for that. But if they are students with disabilities, depending on their level of need, they can receive up to 30,000, and that makes sense versus this really difficult process that's you just don't even know what's going to happen at the end of it. All right, so that is what I wanted to get to today. There's so much more to talk about with IDEA, but I do want people to just kind of be familiar with the terms, to understand that FAPE is not a magic guarantee. It's something that parents fight for, that an IEP does not guarantee services, and accommodations that meet the child's needs. Again, that's something that parents fight for, and that there is this whole due process world that does not receive a lot of attention or coverage. I'd love to know your thoughts on why folks are so scared to dig in and tackle IDEA. It hasn't been reauthorized since 2004. So we're talking over 20 years. And generally, you're supposed to reauthorize bills every, I don't know, 3 to 5 years. That doesn't necessarily happen with education bills in general at the federal level, but over 20 years is a really long time. So clearly, people are scared to tackle IDEA. What's your sense of why that is?
I think it's more at a that administrative funding level where that fear is getting pulled from, because now that we're seeing the opportunity for school choice and funding models with success in other states, like you were talking about Texas, for example, that's scary for the bureaucracy itself and for those that want to keep the funding solely in within the public schools. It's not necessarily that that is the best for the child. And so, that portability of the funding is really a hiccup there. People just don't know how that will then transfer out at the public school level. Some people are scared. That means that we're going to have staffing shortages at the school level there. But with school choice, we know that staffing can shift, right? It brings in competition. It levels up the playing field to make sure that students are receiving quality instruction across the board. If you want to keep your students in your school, then make sure you're providing the top-notch services. Like with anything else, you're not going to go to the car dealership with 3 stars to buy a car or 2 stars. You're going to go to the car dealership with the 5 stars. So
Mhm.
aiming for that is, providing that competition is helpful, but it's that portability. But in the same sense, so much funding is being spent at the school-based level and these district levels fighting due process complaints, right? The legal component has grown to, in some districts like ours in Fairfax County, to, $1 million plus levels. Where do they really want to invest that money? So looking at IDEA to allow that portability, especially around the area of placement talks, is so important to alleviate the adversarial instances that are happening between parents and schools, and all of the money getting shifted more to that legal nature that gets involved when due process complaints and state complaints and OCR complaints are filed. One area, Jenny, is that if parents do parentally, place their child in private school and their child has disabilities, there's still supposed to be funding available for services, right,
Yep.
for that child, although they're very, very limited. So, that's another area that also brings up question with reauthorizing IDEA. What will the obligation then become? Will we have to expand that money that will then go outside the doors to parentally placed private school students?
I feel like what you're saying is that there's a lot of fear within the system that they might lose money and that
Yes,
adults in the system might lose jobs.
yes.
And that was not the goal of IDEA, to protect
No.
adults' jobs and to ensure that funding stays within one system. As you said from the get go, there's been this concept of equitable services, which means all students are supposed to be benefiting from IDEA, regardless of where they are enrolled in school. And that includes private school students, students who are homeschooled. It's a different process, but they do have access to that private services plan, that and some element of services. One reason that I think it's important to bring this up is it hasn't been reauthorized for a really long time. We need to start having a conversation around that. To the system, when you're talking about due process and what parents are fighting against, it's so broken, and we need to start being honest and transparent about that. 3, it's increasingly expensive. There's always this magical thinking in DC, we'll just throw more money at it at the top level, at the appropriations level, and fully fund IDEA, and that will fix things. No, we need to look at what's driving the expenses here. And then 4, I do think we need to have an honest conversation about what students and families really need and the actions that they're really taking. And we see them taking advantage of these state school choice programs. and making sure that their child's needs are met that way. And I think more people need to know that that's happening. Debra, what needs to happen next in your mind? I mean, sure, there's an annual appropriations process that's never going to change. IDEA is always going to be funded at the federal level. Sure, there's the possibility of bureaucrats moving from one office to another. That's happening at the federal level. I don't know how much of a difference that makes to all the things that we're talking about today. But what do you think needs to happen to improve implementation of IDEA, improve access and opportunities for students with disabilities?
There are a few pieces to that, but the most fundamental is ensuring that parents and guardians actually know what their rights are and how to access them, providing the special education data in a more transparent format across our states and even on our own website that we have at the federal level, that parents can understand it. Right now, the data, when it's presented, is very much for the bureaucracy to interpret it.
Mhm.
So if you're moving, say you're a parent and you have a job opportunity, you can look and see, well, what state is really performing well in meeting students with disabilities needs, and specifically my child's disability type that they have, right? So it's often we dump all the data into, SWD, students with disabilities. And not every disability is the same, right? So it's very specific and individualized. So for a parent to be able to look that up and say, okay, well, Texas or Florida or, somewhere, another state is doing something very well. I think I'm going to look there to move there. And then even down to that district, well, that district has really got it. My child has dyslexia. Look at their literacy rates. They've got something really strong there, right? So I want to move there. So parents need to have that information at a very basic level. Right now, the data is not transparent like that. I think that's a very good first step in order to bring the parents into this. I think that will help drive things. As we know, with all the grassroots movements that we saw through COVID, we could see that transfer here for IDEA. And then the other is the portability of the funding would be very, very helpful for parents. So to remove that adversarial aspect, so they don't have to become mentally and physically and bankrupt, exhausted in all different ways to try to access.
When you're talking about portability, like portability of the IDEA funding that their child is entitled to, so portability of
Yes,
that federal funding, that's something
yes,
that Senator Tim Scott, others in Congress have proposed in the past. So revisiting that proposal
yeah.
definitely is worthwhile.
Parents, when they're informed, in my experience, when I have sat down with parents and I go over their child's data and I explain it to them and show them, it just really grows that collaboration with them and in their involvement. When data is cut off from parents or access to it is very limited as far as their child's education record, it creates that adversarial component because if you've got the parents working with you and they see what's going on as far as what their child needs, they can also help at home, right? And it could be in the smallest of ways, even if they don't have a lot of money. But when the education record isn't made available to them under their rights, right, that they have under both FERPA and
I was
IDEA,
gonna say, how can they keep an education record from a parent? There's FERPA on top of IDEA. That's ludicrous.
there sure is, but I can tell you, and that could be a whole other podcast,
Yeah.
it doesn't happen all the time, right? Some school divisions are very good about providing that access, and others are not. So in the digital age that we have, providing perhaps an opt-in to having the education record available, just like everything else, they can just click on it and see, oh, here's my child's evaluations are here. That's great because sometimes it's a bureaucracy. Parents will submit a private provider's evaluation in, and for some reason, it doesn't make it into the record. So you have school staff unaware that this child, has these needs from this most recent evaluation. Um,
And that's after parents have spent thousands of dollars to go get that evaluation,
exactly.
and then it's ignored
Right.
or
So it's also
lost.
a layer of support for the school system because who else is going to make sure that that record is correct than the parent and guardian themselves?
Right.
So I would say that those are at least a couple of the top 3 wishes that would be very helpful.
Those are great. As we wrap up, I like for my guests to tackle myths around education policy. Is there a myth about IDEA that bothers you and that you'd want to address today?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to the funding issue, that it's a funding issue and not an allocation problem. I believe, from both being a teacher and a parent involved in this, that it's an allocation issue. When we look at the pots of money that we have for IDEA and to support our students, we have the federal level funding, we have state, local, and then we also have the branch of Medicaid funding there.
Mm.
We need to look, are we using that funding wisely, and how is it getting allocated before we just start raising the red flag that more money is needed, because we saw a huge influx of funding from the COVID era, right? From that time. And we didn't have that ROI, that return on investment, the outcomes, the meaningful progress. So is it really a funding problem, or is it an allocation problem? And I think that's a very important question that needs to get answered.
How can people follow your work?
Well, I'm online. I have a nonprofit called Emergent Literacy, where you can find instructional resources that you can use at home with your children, and then also reach out if you need some help with advocacy as well. And it's my website address is emergentliteracy.org.
Fantastic. Well, Debra, thank you for your commitment to students with disabilities and their families. Thank you for your commitment to education freedom and parental rights. And thank you for joining Freedom to Learn.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for caring.
Freedom to Learn is a production of the Defense of Freedom Institute. Learn more about our work at dfipolicy.org. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Send feedback, questions, and episode ideas to podcast@dfipolicy.org. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, please follow and review Freedom to Learn on your favorite podcast app and share it with a friend.